So we invite now up to, Dave to give us the first presentation, Jesus' Guide to Happiness from the story of Jesus.
All right, well, good evening everyone. Thanks Jimmy. It's wonderful to be here with you all tonight, and I think to hopefully look at a very, very exciting and in many ways I think life-changing set of teachings that we'll be looking at tonight. So we're going to look, as Jimmy briefly just touched on, at a very powerful sermon that Jesus gave and that's left on record for us. It's called the Sermon on the Mount, and it's Jesus' first ever public address or first public set of teachings that he made. And many would probably be familiar with the word sermon, but if you aren't, it's simply referring to a religious type seminar. That's what it means. And sermons are still being given now, nearly in every church around the world. It's a weekly thing, and it was just as common back in Jesus' day. Now, the overall theme of this Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave was what true religion looks like. Was what true religion really looks like. That's the overall theme of what this sermon teaches. And at this point in history, as Jesus was giving this sermon, the idea of religion had become quite confused in a lot of ways. And Jesus is going to set the record straight about what religion really is all about. Now, it's very relevant for us today because we could probably say the same thing these days, that religion in many ways has become confused. But here is the perfect blueprint for us about what true religion really is. We're not going to deal with the whole sermon in one night. Obviously it's going to be broken up. But tonight the exciting thing is we're going to have a look at a section of this sermon that provides the key to happiness in life. Hence our title, Jesus' Guide to Happiness. And what we'll see is that this happiness is available to any person here in this room, any person really throughout history, despite circumstances that they find themselves in. Jesus teaches that happiness is separate to our conditions of life, things that we go through. It's separate from whether we're healthy or whether we're in ill health. It's separate from whether we have plenty of money and plenty of food or whether we don't have much money or don't have much food. The things that Jesus talks about are not connected to these things in any way, and that might sound odd to a degree, but Jesus shows us how this works. So I believe the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most valuable set of teachings we could ever look at, and potentially the most life-changing as well. Now, to begin with, I just want to look at a verse which Jesus uses himself to summarise the impact of this sermon on someone who listens to it. And Jesus used to teach in a lot of the time he used to teach in parables. And these parables were stories that he told that had an important lesson behind them. And Jesus uses a parable to really describe the importance of his message and what it can do for people like you and I. We'll look at this in Matthew chapter 7, it's up on the screen, verses 24 and 25. This is what he says. It says, "Therefore, whosoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock." Now, Jesus would go on and describe a different type of man who also built a house, but he built his house on sand. He built his house on foundations that were quite weak. And as this storm came, his house would fall over. So the question is, well, what is Jesus actually saying in this parable? What is the lesson behind this? He's not talking about a literal house, and he's not talking about a literal storm. He's talking about living our lives with a strong foundation. And the wind and the rain was referring to pressures in life, pressures that each of us are going to feel. Everyone in this room has pressures in life, all in different ways, but we all have pressure. Jesus is saying that for the person who hears this sermon and listens to him and takes it to heart, no matter what happens to that person in their life, no matter how much pressure they come under in life, they will never ever fall. That's how powerful these words are. Now, if you can imagine living a life with the assurance that no matter what happens to you, no matter what you do, what happens to you, what circumstances and pressures come to you in this life, if you can imagine that despite all of these things, it will all work out for your long-term good, then you're starting to understand what Jesus is referring to as happiness in this sermon. Now, I just want to look at a second verse. Now, Jimmy touched on this very thing in his introduction. This is the people's reaction, those who were there and heard Jesus' sermon. This is their reaction to it. We're told, and so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching. For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Now, these people are used to hearing Bible talks. They're used to hearing people teach to them. But there was something very different about this message, that it had an impact on them. They hadn't heard an address like this before, and in fact, they were astonished at the things that Jesus taught and the way that he addressed them. There was this authority about the way that he spoke, the way that he talked. And I was trying to think about an example of maybe a public address that has had this type of impact on people listening. And the best thing that I could come up with was, in terms of a very impactful speech, was the victory speech of Barack Obama when he was first elected to be the President of the United States. I'm not sure if others in this room remember that moment. It was quite a historical moment. There are probably better examples than this, but I do remember this one. And I remember seeing this address on TV, and the theme of his address was yes, we can, from memory, yes, we can. And at this point in history, he was really being elected in following one of the toughest periods in their history, America's history. It was straight on the back of the financial crisis. And what Obama did in this victory speech was he delivered hope to these Americans who were in desperate need at the time. And I just remember the images of the people who were there listening to that speech, and people were crying. Most people were moved to tears, and then they had images of people in the streets, and they were singing and dancing together, strangers hugging and embracing. That was the impact that this speech had. Now, history would say that unfortunately, Obama didn't quite deliver everything that people may have hoped for. But on this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is offering hope to multitudes who are in desperate need in their lives. In desperate need. They're in need of wisdom, of direction, of true leadership. And these words were words that an individual could build their life on. And it had an amazing impact on these people. And it can have that impact on us. Now, before we jump into the sermon itself, let's just read about what type of crowd this was who was listening to it. So Matthew chapter 4, verse 24 to 25. We read, "Then his fame," this is Jesus, "then Jesus' fame went throughout all Syria. And they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics and paralytics, and he healed them. Great multitudes followed him from Galilee, from Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond Jordan. And then in chapter 5 and verse 1, we read, I don't have this on the screen, we read, and seeing the multitudes, Jesus went up into a mountain. And when he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth, and he taught them. Now, we don't know the exact percentage of people who followed Jesus up the mountain, but I imagine there would have been quite a large audience, and maybe a whole lot more at the base of the mountain waiting for him to return. And maybe as he started to deliver this message, maybe there was people running down the mountain and telling people to come up. This is incredible what we're hearing. Come up and join us. And maybe that as this sermon goes on, there's more and more people as that crowd starts to swell as Jesus teaches. And as we mentioned, the overriding theme of what Jesus is teaching is what true religion looks like. This is the definition, this is the blueprint of what religion was always meant to be. And this was quite a unique idea to the Jewish people. It's important that we just think about this context of the people listening. This idea of true religion and the type of person who would be part of God's family or God's chosen people was a very unique concept. Think about this. So a lot of the Jewish people, many Jewish people believed that they were inherently God's people. That because of who they were, because of the family that they were born into, they were God's chosen people. They had Moses and they had Abraham as their forefathers, and because of that, then they were rightful family members, the chosen. But what Jesus comes and says is that thinking was in fact wrong. That being part of God's family had nothing or little to do with family heritage. It had little to do with where you were born and what family you were born into. And it had everything to do with the attitude within someone's heart. And that was different. That was different to what people saw as being important to religion. So I think that's an important context to this sermon that Jesus is about to give. Now, the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 5 is a section known as the Beatitudes. It's a funny word. The word beatitude is a Latin word meaning blessings. And so Jesus starts this by listing 8 key characteristics or qualities that lead to these blessings. Now, what does the word blessed mean? We read over and over again this word blessed, blessed, blessed. What does this word actually mean? Well, the word means happy. Happy. So these are attributes linked to a happy person. Happiness. Now, when we think about the concept of happiness, we might think about happiness in many different ways. So often we can think of happiness as an emotion or a feeling that comes and goes at various maybe times of the day, different days of the week, or different stages of life. Just in my own personal experience, I'm generally a happier person on a Friday, a Saturday, and a Sunday than maybe I am on a Monday and a Tuesday. But I'm feeling quite happy to be here tonight, so don't worry. But often we do think about happiness as being something that is an emotion that comes and goes. Maybe we're happier when our football team wins, and we're a bit sad when our football team loses, at least for a few hours after. But the happiness that Jesus is referring to here is quite different to that type of happiness, that sort of emotion. What Jesus is referring to is an inner happiness and a peace within someone. Not something that comes and goes on different days of the week, and it's not something that is changed by circumstances in life. And that's really important, because if we remember the people who were here listening to this sermon, they weren't people who were necessarily having easy lives. There would have been a variety of different people, but there were so many people here who were being brought by others because they were tormented, they had terrible illnesses. A lot of the people listening didn't have much in the way of possessions. And Jesus isn't here at this moment fixing all of those problems for these people. He's healing a lot of people, but he's not fixing every person's hardship in their life. But what he says is, you don't need me to fix that to be happy, to find this peace that I'm about to tell you about. So this is completely independent to circumstances in life. And we're all here, aren't we, with all different circumstances, all different pressures in our lives, some that others would never understand or appreciate, but we all have them. Happiness and peace in this sermon is not affected by any of those things. It's independent. That is deeper than any of those things, as we'll see. But how might an average person, or how might anybody go about trying to find happiness in life? How might we go about trying to find happiness in life? How do we go about trying to find happiness in our lives? Well, perhaps these are some of the ways that we go about finding happiness. So maybe we invest in our health. Maybe we try to get fit and eat plenty of good food so we feel good and try to find happiness in that way. Maybe we make friends. We try to make lots of friends. Maybe we try to become popular and find happiness in that way. Maybe it's money, possessions, a good job, achieving something great either in our careers or being known for something. Maybe we go about finding happiness through education, learning more, becoming very smart. Maybe we like partying and having a good time, and maybe just having a good laugh is what happiness is for others. Now, a lot of these things, it's important to note, is good ways, some of these things at least, are good ways to experience happiness. Some of these things do lead to an element of happiness. And what Jesus is about to say is not contradicting some of these things. What Jesus is saying is that there's a deeper happiness. There's a different sort of happiness that is lasting, it's permanent, it doesn't go, it doesn't come and go like a lot of these things provide. So what does Jesus say? Well, Jesus, he doesn't list things. That's the first thing. He doesn't list things as the key to happiness. In fact, what Jesus does in this sermon, in Matthew chapter 5, is he lists attributes. Not things, attributes. So what are these attributes? Well, this is the list of attributes that Jesus says is the key to happiness. So poor in spirit, they that mourn, the meek, they that hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, and those who are persecuted for righteousness. Now, there are some obvious things that we need to question when we read a list like this. The first question that I would have is that, well, this doesn't look like a list of things that you would consider a happy person to have. So if you were describing maybe a person and who you didn't know, and maybe you're reading about this person and you read all the attributes that this person had, and this was the list, I don't think that you would naturally think, well, that would sound like a very happy person. They must be just buzzing in life. It just doesn't look like that, does it? Someone who's poor in spirit, someone who's mourning, someone who is being persecuted. who's been treated harshly for doing the right thing. Just doesn't seem like a happy person. So how does this all work? That's what we want to look at what Jesus is actually teaching. Now we're not going to look through all of these tonight. It's just too much to deal with in any one night. So I'd rather choose to focus on a select few, and I think that there's a good reason for that. So what I want to look at first tonight, primarily, is these three key attributes. Poor in spirit, they that mourn, and the meek. Now I think if we can really understand these three attributes that Jesus is listing, then that is the key to finding your happy foundation in life. Okay? I think this is what creates the happy foundation. And when we consider the rest of those attributes naturally flow on from these first few. In fact, this isn't a list of 8 separate things. These all work together. So it's not like we work at one, and then we work at another one, and then we work at the 5th one, and then we try and master the next one until finally we get there and we've mastered all 8, and then, I'm happy. Finally, I'm happy. It's not really like that. They all work together in unison. And it's like a domino effect. When we truly understand what Jesus is saying in these first few attributes, then they fall like dominoes. It all fits together and it all works. Hopefully, it all makes sense. Now, let's jump into the first few. So, verse 3 and 4, we read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Now, importantly, this word poor, so blessed are the poor in spirit. The word poor means to crouch like a beggar. That's what the word means. It's a very, it's a very descriptive word. And it produces an image in our head. So someone who's sort of leant over and is begging, okay? I'm sure that at some point in our lives we've all seen someone begging for money. And I'm not thinking about, when you're young and you're begging your parents for money. It's slightly different. This is someone who is really desperate, very, very, very desperate in their life. And so we don't see many beggars in Australia. But if we were to travel to developing countries, we would see a lot more. Remember, many years ago, traveling to Bali a few times, and they're just beggars are everywhere. People just the whole day sitting there with their hand open, asking for help. And I think it's difficult to really understand the state of mind that someone has to get to in order to beg for money from someone else. Most of us, maybe some of us have, but most of us probably haven't been in that kind of position before, because it's really your last resort. And to get down on your hands and knees and to beg for someone's money or food is... every bit of pride in that person has gone well before that happens. There's no pride left in someone who's at that point where they would put their trust in someone they don't even know, a stranger. They don't even know this person, begging them for help, for assistance. That's what this word that Jesus is using is actually describing. If we imagine, it's such a powerful word that he's using. Now, Jesus is not literally talking about someone who is in poverty and has no material things. Although it can relate to that, definitely. But he's not primarily talking about that literal situation. But what he is referring to is he's referring to a state of mind of a person, someone's state of mind. He's talking about someone who is acutely aware of just how helpless they are as a person, just how helpless they really are on their own. It's about understanding that, yes, we may be able to build what looks like an incredible life for ourselves, but similar to building a great house on a bad foundation, the lives we live in our own strength and just in our own ability can be destroyed at any moment. And we know that. We all know of stories of that. Of someone who has a great life one day and the very next day, that life is turned upside down. Now that is humanity. That's our condition as humans. We live with that every day, don't we? We live with the knowledge of that. And we can put it aside. We can ignore it. We can live our lives as if that's not the case in our own ability and our own resources and strengths. But what Jesus is saying is that the poor in spirit is someone who is, firstly, acutely aware of their weakness as a human, and that they are dependent, that they're dependent on something greater, on someone, on a wisdom that is greater than their own. That's what this attribute is all about. It's about dependence on God, to the point where really the image here is someone who's not just begging for money, but they're moved to tears. They're mourning. So not only are they begging, they're mourning. They're on their knees and they're reduced to tears, and they are asking or putting their dependence on something greater. That's the attribute. And this is where the foundation starts to form, this foundation of happiness. So, why are these people happy? What is it about this that really is something that could produce happiness? I just want to read two quotations from the book of Isaiah, and you can, if you want to, you can turn these two up, but I'm just going to read them from the screen. So the first one is in Isaiah 66. Okay. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you will build for me? And where is the place of my rest? For all those things my hand has made, and all those things exist, says the Lord. But on this one will I look, on him who is poor and of a contrite spirit, and who trembles at my word." Okay, now I'm just going to read one more from Isaiah. "For thus saith the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, with him who has a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones." Now Jesus is drawing from this concept when he talks about the poor in spirit and they that are mourning. This great God, whose power and greatness goes so far beyond our own abilities, chooses to dwell not with great people on the planet, not with people who have everything in line and in order, not with the successful ones necessarily. His place of rest is with the humble. That's what it says. His place of rest is with the humble. So that's saying that that God looks down on this earth and he sees people. And he sees people who have a spirit of humbleness, who are desperate and who are aware of their need in something greater. And he sees people who in that state put their hands out and turn to him. And he says, of all the places that I could live, of all the places that I could inhabit, he could choose anywhere in the universe to dwell. He says, that is exactly where I choose to dwell. I choose to dwell with that person. I will enter the life of that person. It's an incredible thought. And that's why these people ultimately are happy people. It's not produced from within, it's from outside coming within. That's what creates happiness. because God is with these people and they're comforted by his presence. And so, to commence this sermon, Jesus is saying that in order to have true peace and happiness in our lives, the starting point is to develop a dependence on God. That's really the start of everything. Without that, there's no start, really. It starts with a dependence. And that requires us as humans to put away pride, self-assurance, and to rely on God, to rely on him in appreciating our own weakness. So then he moves on. Jesus moves on, back in Matthew chapter 5, and he talks about this next attribute, which is also there's so much wisdom tied up in this. In verse 5 of Matthew 5, he says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now this flows perfectly on from this poor in spirit and they that are mourning. But we have to understand what this term means. So this word meekness, the meaning of this is actually controlled strength. That's what it means, controlled strength. Now, it's a little bit tricky to get our heads around this concept. So I'll just give a few examples of this, or a couple of examples. Now, God shows meekness to us as humans, and this is a great example of controlled strength. So, if God was to reveal his full strength, so if God was really to fill this room here right now with all of his strength and all of his glory, what would happen? Does anyone know? Jet? Yeah, yeah. It might explode. The room might explode. I'll tell you who might really explode. We probably would explode. We wouldn't be able to stand and survive in that presence due to God's greatness. And so in dealing with human beings, God has to rein in his strength. He can't just show us all his strength and his glory, because we wouldn't survive. Now, there's an example of this in Exodus. And God, this is back a story with the Israelites and Moses. And God said, I'm going to show the people just a really tiny element of my greatness, of my glory. And does anyone know what happened when he did that?
Everyone was terrified.
Yeah. So it's like a very dramatic scene, and there are people there, and they are just immediately struck with fear, and they all just start scrambling to try and get as far away as they can. And it says that people were so scared that they thought they were going to drop dead. So they thought that such was their terror that it's like, oh, I'm going to die. Like, I'm literally just going to die through terror. And this was just an element of God's glory and his power. So God really is the ultimate example of what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about meekness, controlled strength for the sake of something else, okay? Now, another example is this. So I've got two boys, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and both of them like to wrestle with me. And I'm not a particularly strong person, but compared to them, I'm quite strong. And they think I'm pretty strong, which is fantastic. So, but as I'm wrestling with them on the ground, what I have to be careful of is that I don't go too far, because of my exceedingly great strength compared to theirs. If I was just to grab them and just to throw them down on the ground with all my might, they're trying as hard as they can, by the way. So they're not controlling their strength. They're going as hard as they possibly can. But as a father, I'm restraining my strength. And that's this concept of meekness. That's really what it means, is controlled strength. Now, how it relates back to what Jesus is actually talking about, or the meekness that Jesus is talking about, is all about where a person chooses to place their trust, okay? Or, probably better put, who a person sees as being their source of strength, okay? So, a proud person will choose to rely solely on themselves. So, a proud person will decide that I'm strong enough. And in this life, I am going to go it alone, and I'm going to use all my own strength, my own wisdom, my intelligence, and I'm going to make it for myself in this life. That is the opposite of this attribute. A meek person will choose to let go of any strength that they think they have, any ability they think they have to control and run their own lives on their own, and they will replace it with something so much stronger. That's this controlled strength. That's God's strength. This is what Jesus is saying a meek person does. And that person will be blessed and happy. Now, there's a brilliant example of this in someone's life. And the example is the story of Moses, which is an incredible story. But I just want to tell you a little bit about this story because I think it really emphasizes the amazing things that flow from meekness, okay, in someone's life. So, Moses grew up. So firstly, Moses is known in Scripture as the meekest of all men. So he's known as someone who has this attribute more so than just about anyone else who's lived. But Moses grew up in the house of Pharaoh through amazing circumstances. He was an Israelite, and he found his way into the house of Pharaoh, which probably these days would be like growing up maybe in the royal family or something like that. That's kind of what it's like. One of the most privileged positions you could ever think of on the planet. So he grew up in that situation, but he knew that God had called him to something much greater than this. He knew that as an Israelite, and the Israelites were slaves, they were servants in Egypt, okay? They were in bondage. And he was an Israelite living in the house of Pharaoh. And he knew that his role, he'd been chosen from the day he was born to do what? Anyone know? So, this is great, no one knows. I think a lot of people know. His role was to deliver the people, to lead the people out of Egypt to freedom. That's what Moses was called to do from the day he was born. And Moses knew this. Now, when Moses was 40 years old, he thought, okay, now is the time. I'm 40. And so what he does is he goes out and he sees an Israelite being attacked by an Egyptian. And Moses, what does Moses do? Lily.
Beats him up.
Yeah. The Egyptian. So Moses turns on the Egyptian, beats him up, and he actually kills him. So he kills the Egyptian. And what Moses thought was, he thought, right, now I'm ready to lead this people out. And all the Israelites are going to see that I'm the one who's been chosen, that I'm going to lead them out. But what happened was, to Moses' shock and surprise, was that the Israelites said, we don't need your help. Who do you think you are? We don't need your help at all. And so Moses then just runs away, and he's 40 years old, and he just runs. And he runs to a place called Midian. And this place, Midian, was just like this little humble village. And at Midian, he becomes a shepherd. And so as a shepherd, the shepherds it was not a job that, you were climbing the ladder to get to. So this is right at the very bottom, being a shepherd. There wasn't too many positions that were lower than this. And so Moses goes from being like in the royal family to now like being as low as low in this little village that is tiny. So he's basically run off he's run off the face of the planet. And he then spends the next 40 years doing that. So after the next 40 years, he's now 80 years of age. And God appears to Moses, and God says to Moses, right, now you're ready. You're ready to lead my people out of Egypt. Let's go. And what does Moses say? It's interesting because 40 years earlier, I think Moses would have said, let's go for it. I'm ready. I've been waiting. I can do this. You've chosen the right person. But what Moses says is, this is what he says, who am I, God, that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? So this is a massive swing in Moses, in his attitude. And 40 years after killing that Egyptian man, here is this person with no confidence at all in his own ability to do anything, let alone lead a nation out of bondage. He says to God, there's a better person for this job. I'm not the right person to do this. You don't understand. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I can't do that. And God says, you're right. I'm going to do it, Moses. It's going to be my strength. And I need you to rely on my strength to do this. Now that is what meekness is, okay? That is a brilliant demonstration of meekness. This is Moses who understands that he's going to function not through his own strength. He's going to do something incredible. He's not going to do it in his own strength. He's going to rely on God every single day to do that. And that's how the story goes. It's Moses leaning on God every single day. God's wisdom, God's strength. That is meekness. That is what Jesus is saying. That's the attribute that leads to happiness. Now, it wasn't just Moses who really understood this, the power of this. This is Paul, so the Apostle Paul, who wrote quite a lot of books in the Bible. But this is what he says based on his experiences in life. He says, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So in other words, Paul says that when in life, he's put in a position that compels him to rely on God, or when some circumstances in life come that he just does not have the answers for, he doesn't know how he's going to deal with this problem, he doesn't know how he's going to get out of this situation, he's got no answers at all. He says, I actually have learnt in that situation in life to actually rejoice and be happy, because then I know that I'm going to be forced into a much stronger position in life. I'm going to be forced to rely on someone greater. And that someone greater is going to deliver me. That someone greater is going to lead me and guide me. That's what Paul says. And that is what Jesus is saying is meekness. It's when we understand that we need something greater and that we decide that we don't have the answers in this life. We don't have all the answers, but God does, and we choose to rely on that. So, in this incredible sermon, Jesus says that the person who humbles themselves to understand their need for God, and those who place their trust in God in meekness, they will be blessed. They will find an inner peace and a happiness because God will be with them. So these are the attributes, these are the 8 things, and we've only just really looked into the first 3. But we've looked at the foundation, the happiness foundation, and the rest of these attributes start to fall like dominoes into our lives. Once we put away pride and we rely on God, then naturally it leads to a hunger and a thirst to understand Him more, to understand the Creator more and what He wants from us. And if we have an understanding of our own failure and our own dependence on God's grace, then we have no trouble being merciful to others. We understand mercy that's been shown to us, and then we will show mercy to others. And then being pure in heart and peacemakers, they go hand in hand with humility that we've learnt, because it's pride that leads to fighting. It's pride that makes us stand up for ourselves and defend our rights. And without this pride ruling our lives and a need to defend ourselves and our rights, then we're the sort of person who would be persecuted for doing the right thing and allow ourselves to be persecuted in the name of doing the right thing. So these attributes just all start to work together as one. So, to summarise this first section of this most incredible set of teachings that we have, Jesus is saying that finding peace and true happiness in life is all about the foundation that we stand on in life. It's the foundation that we stand on every day as we live. It's the person who with humility can see that as humans, by ourselves, left to our own strength and resources, life is unstable. If that is how we live our lives, then it's like a house that's built on a bad foundation. And our lives can tumble over at any moment, at any time. The source of true happiness and peace, as Jesus teaches, is building a life not based on our own strength and our own resources, but it's on God's. That is a foundation that will always keep us secure, no matter what circumstances or pressures come to us in this life. And so this is a great lead-in now to the next 5 series, where Jesus really opens up and looks inside a person, and He invites people to look inside themselves and to see why we do things, why we act and why we behave. And so hopefully it'll be great to see everyone here again next Tuesday as we continue looking at this most incredible Sermon on the Mount. So thank you.